Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us. This webinar is called Why Amazon's River Club Development is Not Sustainable. My name is Nina Callahan, and I'm a researcher here at the Center for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University. So, as our name indicates, we inquire into sustainability, what it means, for who, at what cost to people, place, and planet. We appreciate that the concept of sustainability is not neat and tidy. There's no simple solution. And I think this complexity is reflected in our topic today, that appreciates one perspective around the contested development for the River Club, where Amazon intends to set up headquarters in South Africa. The plan is to build a huge mixed-use development on the land at the confluence of the Black and Liesbeek rivers, land that is of immense historical and spiritual significance for First Nation Khoi people, as well as being a sensitive environmental precinct. So today, to talk to us, we welcome Professor Leslie London and Tariq Jenkins, part of the leadership of the Make the Liesbeek Matter campaign. It's part of a civic organization who stand opposed to this development. Leslie is a professor of public health at UCT, who somehow finds time to help head up this initiative, along with Tariq, who is the High Commissioner for the Goring Haikona Khoikhoi Indigenous Traditional Council. A very warm welcome to you both, Leslie and Tariq. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to share this presentation with you. We are a civic association allied with a number of NGOs, other First Nation groups, other civics, and we are campaigning against the redevelopment of which we complete an sustainable development. I'll briefly first, and then start to take any questions. This picture from Devil's Peak gives you a locator as a very important coast-to-coast green strip, and this is the piece of development, a piece of land that's under threat. Here is the River Club land. On the left-hand side, you'll see the Liesbeek Parkway and the Liesbeek River. On the right-hand side, the Black River. In the distance, Table Bay and Robben Island. In the foreground, you'll see the copse of trees where the South African Astronomical Observatory is located, and further closer to you is Falkenberg. The River Club land is actually a small, wavy piece of land, 14.7 hectares at the tip of the park, marked in red. It's not just any piece of land, as Tariq will explain. It's a piece of land of immense heritage importance where First Nation indigenous peoples defeated the Portuguese invaders and were subsequently subjected to various dispossessions by the Dutch, but I'll leave that to Tariq to share. But that's the site where Amazon are coming to put their headquarters, a huge behemothing 5-building set on the land that has huge heritage and environmental significance. And just to remind us all, land was a public land. It was owned by the railways. It was the River Club itself. The building was built in 1939 for white railway workers as part of the apartheid process. You know, the history of how white workers were basically lifted out of poverty through the development of resources for recreation. And that land was actually held public trust, and public was only sold in 2015 to private developers. And it's part of the park. It's part of this urban park, and should remain as such. In the 50s, the Liesbeek River, which is key to the heritage importance of the area, was canalized on the right-hand side. So a new pathway was created, and most of the water was diverted. On the left-hand side, you'll see the sump, which is the place at which the river connects in its original course with a continuation of the river here. And the fact that the developers have been able to claim that the original course of the Liesbeek River is degraded or neglected stormwater gutter is not sort of an act of God or natural. It's actually the result of human action. Here's a newspaper cutting from 2013 where the River Club itself was responsible for remodeling the riverbank without any approvals and a cease work notice. The picture shows clearly how much debris was dumped in the river. So the fact that the river is under stress, is degraded, is not a given. It's actually the result of human action. To claim that the river can't be rehabilitated is to ignore that history and context. Of course, we know that PROSA itself has been the subject of great investigation. And in 2005, it was more or less the pinnacle, the ending point of the gutting of PROSA by state capture. The land that is now the River Club was sold to the Liesbeek Leisure Property Limited, which held a long-term lease for running a Mashi golf course and various other recreational activities. But it was sold for the price of 12 million, which is far below the market value of the land. It was sold because it was sold as bare dominium, which we understand to be a sale of a piece of land where a third party has a knew what they do. But in this case, the third party was actually the first party. So the land was sold to the lease owners. So in the end, they got a very cheap deal and were able to raise a bond then from Investec, which presumably was used to start the speculative process, which led to the development application. But this is the origin of where the development started. It was public land sold for a song to a private entity. And as you can see, the decision-making in this process has rapidly escalated since that sale. There have been processes related to rezoning by the city, processes related to environmental authorizations by the Department of Environment and Development, and then Heritage Western Cape has played a role as well, sometimes marginalized, in fact, generally marginalized. So this is the final development proposal on this piece of land. You can see the Berkeley Road extension is created to run over the Black River. Some Department of Works has been agitating for some time, but now sees the opportunity to be clear. Across the canal, you can see the South African Astronomical Observatory, where the land is very green, and that's the kind of density you would expect in a park. Here you have very dense buildings, some of which are 44 meters high. The lowest building is 20 meters high, so this is a very big development, very dense. How big is a 44-meter high building? Well, this is a picture of the silos in Salt River, a few hundred meters further down the road. The actual silos reach 49 meters, but the buildings are 40-odd meters. So this is the scale of buildings that are going to be put on site, 4 or 5 of these 40-meter high buildings on the floodplain. And this is just a shot from the developer's own documents, giving you a sense of how the visual impacts will be affected and how what is existing on the plain will be at dense buildings. So there's Amazon, who only really appeared later in the course of the environmental application, a private school. And you get a sense that in order to accommodate this density, you have to have a lot of concrete on that floodplain. And this is the reason. It's very interesting. The developer's environmental application, when it considers development alternatives, puts out this information, different amounts of floor space, and different permutations of where the precinct is and mixed use, etc. And, you know, basically they're estimating first year in returns, which range from 7.4 to 9%. And here's a comment from Appendix K2, which is the property market comments. And they say, taking into consideration the above factors, current economic sentiment, forecast market trends, we believe feasibility prospects and potential development returns with market capitalization rates that are substantially below 9% are not commercially viable, particularly in the present investment environment. Hence, we are of the opinion that development scenarios 1 and 2 for the River Club are the most feasible investment opportunities. And this is where it all starts, because feasibility in this application has been defined purely in terms of economic feasibility. And as we know under NEMA, feasibility has to take account of the wide range of social, environmental, human factors and not just be about money. But this is the point. And ironically, of course, the property market comments on which this is based is written by a consultant who works for the same company that is invested in the development, who does work for Investec. So the conflict of interest is never named, and the whole NEMA process doesn't allow any kind of control of that sort of conflict of interest. So that is why the chosen option is very dense, and it has to be dense because Amazon's campus is very dense. It's huge behemoths buildings. They have sort of standard boilerplate kind of approaches. And each building, that's why the development doesn't compromise on shrinking the amount of concrete being put on the floodplain. And what are the consequences? So flooding. So we know the area floods. This picture is not that unusual. The developers, hydrologists claim that there was very little difference in the extent of flooding. In other words, the place floods already. We put 50,000 meters of concrete, raise the land by 3 meters. It's going to be a little bit worse. But there are some problems in this. Climate change science is changing very rapidly. The study used sea level rise data that was outdated, and in fact, even went as far as to say an investigation of the impact of sea level rise is beyond the scope of this study. However, in his interest to take further modeling to assess how climate change and sea level rise impacts could be mitigated. But their modeling actually used that data from 2010. And even though they say that the cities, it was agreed with the city that such data should be used, it's very odd because the city's own environmental management department appealed the environmental authorization, saying that basically using this data was a significant underestimate in respect of applying the precautionary principle approach. So we don't know who agreed to it because somebody afterwards said this was not good enough. So on the one hand, you have a situation where developer says, well, the impact is not significant, or if it is, it's minor. On the other hand, you have the city's own environmental manager saying this impact is not insignificant. And we know that because the developers actually approached a homeowner in Observatory whose houses are about 200, 300 meters away from the River Club to indicate that the developer would offer to floodproof the basement of that house at their charge because of the impacts. As it turned out, it was not followed through. The homeowners told us that the consultants were told by the River Club developers not to engage with Observatory Civic. So we don't know exactly why that's the case, but clearly there was some recognition that this is going to aggravate flood. City's Environmental Management Department also made the point that the river corridor is an integrated complex of open space areas with high green infrastructure value. Not only does the area offer value into social and recreational diversity, but it also represents green infrastructure. Except that many spaces have already been in base remnants, such as Truck and the River Club, therefore have even greater value. And the site is a structuring open space forming part of a coast-to-coast greenway. This development will irrevocably change and reduce the green infrastructure and open space value of the area as a whole. This is the river that the developers plan in for, and the city makes this point that the Liesbeek River and floodplains are part of a metropolitan-scaled ecological corridor and open space system linking Table Bay to the north and False Bay to the south, the coast-to-coast greenway. Of course, there's also biodiversity to consider. There are a number of species either threatened or endangered. Citybay commented that infilling of a natural river channel cannot be considered positive from an environmental perspective. They also point out that the claim that the urban development nodes, the so-called core nodes that the NSD talks about, does not override the biodiversity network, as if development were more important than conserving biodiversity. It would be willing to give up its biodiversity conservation obligations to Cape Nature in the area. The city's environmental management division also raised 26 concerns about climate change. You're basically infilling a river, you're filling in a floodplain, you're putting down lots of concrete, which creates heat islands, many other factors. all of which prompted the developers actually to get in another consultant who produced a report which basically said, if you are going to put 150,000 square meters of concrete on a floodplain, this is the best way to do it. They didn't ask the question of, is it the right thing to put 150,000 meters on a floodplain? As you know as well, alternatives under EIAs are often treated with only the most cursory attention, and that was the case here. For instance, a Delft University study proposed a way in which the existing river could be conserved, but that report was completely ignored in the EA process. I do draw attention to comments made to us by Vanessa Watson. These comments are on our website if anybody is interested. And she basically, as a very experienced town planner, makes the point that there's no overriding spatial logic to put this development in this site. The existing plans envision open natural space, and there are other sites that are more accessible, that are located in economic corridors where this is already planning development. The site is far away from existing nodes. There's no transport opportunities. The buildings themselves proposed are introverted, so they don't produce any interface with the external or the outside environment. There are dead-edge ground floor parking arrangements which are incompatible with the socioeconomic benefits are vastly inflated. For instance, inclusionary housing is very limited. At the end of the day, only 4% of the development footprint. And that is really a drop in the ocean for Cape Town's needs, and it will likely bypass the gap market, which is the key market aimed for. And of course, it will simply destroy the space. And his proposal does that any piece of land could be filled with buildings to add to a cityscape shows a complete disregard of good planning processes. It could become a Dubai or Shanghai, and that is not what we want. So what has happened? DEDP that has joined the developer in a post-heritage protection for the River Club, but they are the decision makers in the EA, and they basically ignored Heritage Western Cape's final comment, which said that this was not compatible with the National Heritage Resources Act. And in fact, when they appealed, they said the environmental authorization was unlawful. People own SOP coming to this matter. So these are the issues we are going to take to High Court on review. The city, on its part, allowed us as objectives the opportunity to do the same, because they said, oh, well, then the developer wouldn't have seen it. They convened the MPT when they should have re-advertised the application because there were new documents, more than 2 years had passed. And they welcomed the development when they said Amazon's coming to Cape Town. So we don't know exactly what behind the scenes arrangements or commitments have been made already. So I don't need to say to this audience or repeat the Brundtland definition of what development is if it's going to be sustainable. The bizarre thing is that the development application actually used the same language, said that the triple bottom line argument must be considered in a balanced manner, because it resulted in significant cumulative negative environmental impacts and unsustainable development. So it does go to show how language can be used and misused in the interest of power. And so we are going to court, an alliance of civic, COI, and NGOs. We are going to seek a review of the two decisions, the rezoning and the environmental authorization, and the appeals that were rejected. And in order to ensure that we are able to do that, we're also applying for an edict, which will be heard on the 16th of August, to pen the building. And I've put out there any information. We have a petition site with a lot of information. We have a fundraising site and contacts if anybody wants to contact. So I'm going to hand over to Tariq now to explain the critical importance of heritage for the problem.
Thank you very much, Professor London. I'd like to, point out maybe the following key historic and heritage narratives that really underpin why this particular piece is of such significance to the Silent Khoi. Let me begin by saying that fresh water in the Kora language is tamis, and in Khoekhoegowab it's called tama. The drinking water that emanates from Hurikwaho is a water complex of tributaries, including the Lisbek and the Black River. These are sacred rivers to the San and Khoi. The Gorenaikona are historically recognized as the keeper of water, described as the Amakwa, which means water people. It's a term attributed to one of our historic roles as the diplomatic interface between the peninsular Khoi and seafarers from around pre-colonial and colonial periods. Between the 1400s and the 1600s, thousands of ships passed via the port of Tamisa, which is today Table Bay, which forms part foundation of the city of Cape Town. And water in all its manifestations is life, and then was also about saving lives. The Lisbek River was called the Vash River. And before that, it was the Amstel by the Dutch. But it must be noted that the Lisbek River was named by Jan van Riebeeck himself. This renaming reframed the area, and in so doing contributed to linguistic and spiritual ransacking of its traditional and historical roots. This was the first step in the erosion of a sense of place, of reverence and reference to the Khoi and San. In 1657, we saw the beginnings of the ultimate colonial conquest of this country, the granting of the very first title deeds by the Freeburger farmers by the Dutch East India Company. These farms, located on the embankments of the Lisbek River, including the River Club, was where land was stolen and justified by the imposition of Roman Dutch law in our country. This resulted in the fencing, enclosing, measurement, and demarcation of land. It is the site of the first occupied territory by colonial powers for the purposes of commercial agricultural production for the VOC. This is where the notion of property and private ownership from a universal common, which the Khoi and San had been the custodians for a millennia. And it should be noted that both colonial legacies of Lisbek and property emanate from this site. Importantly, this is where the sacred river was fenced off and cut off from the indigenous Khoi. Van Riebeeck built a barricade on the Lisbek River from this site, the River Club, up to the river's origins in Constantia. The barricading of the river from the Khoi was a violent act that disconnected the deep symbiotic relationship the Khoi has with its riverine systems, the land, animals, and the cosmos. Water is life, and it provides means to ritual of cleansing and spiritual connectivity. The particular groups like the Gorenaikona, Khochokwa, Korana, Khoekhoegowab, Gorenaikona have historical and a shared sense of place here. So do also the San. The exile of the mixed Khoi Ualam formations that made their trek to Namibia and conjoined the Naba shared the significance of this place. The entire Southern African landscape was impacted by the event that occurred there. This eruption of the first frontier wars resulting from land occupation and dispossession caused the restriction of access to the river, theft of capital of the Khoi, and this precipitated into 16 wars of resistance over a 184-year period. This prompted what we also understand as the Khoi Mfecane, or mass migration. From this epicenter of violent conquest, San and Khoi groups fanned across the country and Southern African region. The result also was the genocide of the Cape San, massacre and forced removals of various other groups. These descendants are the tributary diverse groupings that make up a significant part of the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape, and they include the so-called colored community. It's from this site, this river, that we can see exactly where we as Africans were dislodged, relocated, and divorced of our heritage and sense of belonging. These rivers and the embankments are referred to as the birthplace of the Kuna, the complete summation of our sense of knowing and belonging. It is our place of return to a self that remembers what it means to belong, to be African, and to be human. The memory of water speaks to the memory of our country. For anyone to tell us, expert or not, that the Lisbek and the Black River are of no heritage significance is to us a vicious act of ethnocide and a denial which is most unforgivable. No expert can try to remove the significance of this river from our memory, which is held in the DNA of the roots of mankind itself. These was whole memory of our ancestors defeated the Portuguese in 1510 and prevented our country from being a Portuguese slave route. It holds the memory of Alchumao, Krotoa, Doma, and Chief Krosoa. These rivers, the Lisbek and the Black Confluence on the floodplain, is the most sacred to the San and Khoi. The area is known as Kamilo de Kayes, which means place of the stars. SAO is built built on a mound, the Royal Observatory claimed by the British Empire, which was where our ancestors navigated the stars for themselves. The reflection of these stars on the river and the mythology that they have pronounced is unmistakable. From the confluence of the once sweet waters, we see the equinox of the sun setting on the Lion's Head on the equinox. We see the sun setting on the Lion's Head. It's a unique genus loci. It's of sanctity. But the expert may tell us, because they know that the river needs to be rehabilitated and that it is in fact a stormwater ditch. Who makes our memory a stormwater ditch? She is a river, a being embodied not just in the mountain, a being embodied in the folklore of the supreme being of Tui Kuab and of Tach and the Mantis. The river holds the memory of the Quagga, the Cape Black, lion, animals of spiritual significance that were shot to extinction, including the bluebuck, leaving an eternal hole of mourning, of loss from this terrain. These animals quenched from these rivers, including hippos and antelope and elephants. Now, the river was never polluted, nor near to the point where we can no longer drink from it when the San and Khoi inhabited the embankments. Neither was the western leopard toad verging on extinction, neither the current degradation of the rhinosterfelt. Land theft, slavery, massacre, and genocide is resulted from what occurred on the site itself. It's therefore best described as a ground zero precinct, a place where the colonial bomb first hit, and therefore holds a unique and entirely authentic reference point for restoration, healing, and acknowledgement. And as such, it means that how we assess the resources on the site and how we view and evaluate must go through a decolonial framework that looks beyond the limitations of the development lens. So firstly, we don't accept and we have not consented to the infill of this river. We do not accept artificially directed sacred rivers. We did not attempt to destroy and manipulate our rivers in the first place, and we don't consent to their destruction. The water and land cannot be separated. This terrain is sacred. We don't dig up sacred terrain of our ancestors to fill them up with 150,000 square meters of concrete bulk, and then to put a heritage center on top of it to commemorate our history. Our history is not to be evaluated in the same way as, say, Ratanga Junction in Canal Walk. The land, the river, the cosmos are an intricate and inalienable part of who we are, of the self. We recognize the River Club as part of an epicenter of not just colonial conquest of disposition, but the beginnings of how indigenous communities were ripped apart in the first instance. It should be emphasized that it's not just any piece of land. It's a piece of land of great historical significance for all Africans. It's a site of resistance against colonial intrusion. And it's a place where the slaves were brought down for the first time for agricultural reasons. And they came from all over the world, where Afrikaans as a language was born. The River Club might be a privately owned place, but its history belongs to humanity. It also belongs to the San and the Khoi, who once roamed this area. The relevance and significance cannot be undone, not with concrete or landfill hotels, nor the threats of a redirected river. It's a sacred place. It's up for a whole range of grading processes. A national heritage site, also on the list of DCAS as a World Heritage Site. President Cyril Ramaphosa last year signed with Cabinet the Khoi and San National Liberation and Resistance routes. And yet all these heritage resources are either being downplayed or denied in order to justify an Amazon headquarters, which to us is beginning to behave a neo-colonial entity where it wants to place its particular headquarters on the site where we want a World Heritage Site. We also have demarcated this particular place for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the San and Khoi. Amazon can't be our manumission, a symbol of our victory. They had nothing to do with our heritage of liberation and resistance, and neither does the current developer. And so the commodification of this heritage is vehemently objected to. And we consider that many aspects of this process, including the heritage impact assessment and the basic assessment report, are in many ways unethical in that they do not address the issues of restitution, of reparation. And also, in many ways, we consider that there are aspects about this entire process that have delimited and have ethnocided and have attempted to remove very important aspects of our history and remove aspects of heritage resources off the site, creating a Bermuda Triangle that once again will legitimize the clear intentions of 150,000 square meters of commercial bulk.
Thank you, Tariq, and thank you, Leslie. I'm reminded of a phrase which says, "Those who were here are still here," and I hear that very clearly in all of the actors who are present in this proposed development, from a very early history to a colonial history, and to now our recent tussles with how we understand place and what is good development. And I'm very struck by what preoccupies us in thinking about sustainability are the measurables and the immeasurables. And how do we bring these two together in our assessments, in our considerations? So thank you very much, both of you. There are some questions and a lot of comments, people who appear to have been following this development and also your campaign. There are some very clear questions. The first one I'm going to read out is by Anna Taylor, and she's asking, what other sites have been considered by Amazon? Are there any means by which the land could be returned to public ownership?
So we know that Amazon had been considering various sites. We don't know which sites they're considering, but they chose this one as their first choice. We don't know the extent to which they were aware of the significance of this site. We've certainly tried to make them aware. We've written to them twice, thrice, no replies. It's their way of doing business, I guess. Is there a way of learning? Well, in the Heritage Western Cape issued a provisional protection order over the land because of the threat to heritage, which is now materialized. And in that very first meeting, there were a number of First Nation Khoi chiefs there who were very angry about this development. And one of the chiefs basically slams his fist down on the table and says, this land must be expropriated without compensation. It'll be the first one that goes to the president. So there is the radical answer to that. There's a less radical answer to that, that there's a land swap. You know, there's a lot of public land available, private land available. The fact that Amazon want to invest in Cape Town, people can have concerns about Amazon's business practices, but investment is good. There's other places where the investment can go. We don't have to put a private school and Amazon on a sacred floodplain. So a land swap, basically buying out the land. To me, it's actually inconceivable that public land can be deployed in this way. Despite all the claims of public benefits, the harms are really substantial.
Mm-hmm.
If I can just add, I think that we know that the city of Cape Town is one of the largest property owners, and so is province. And I think it's important for them to come clear with the proper inventory in terms of what not just land, but also buildings that are being underutilized, and that this be addressed in terms of addressing apartheid spatial planning. And if the argument here is that this development is going to provide jobs, and what we are saying is that the reason why this development is so expensive is because it's built on a floodplain. You've got to put the concrete into the floodplain, create a concrete block, and build on top of it. Now, if you take 4.5 billion rand off the floodplain, anywhere else, you build 3 to 4 of these developments, and ostensibly employ 3 to 4 people, 3 to 4 times more people, instead of devastating the floodplain and desiccating a heritage that is of great sanctity and reverence. The idea that the descendants of the Khoikhoi and San would now have to dig up the terrain of their ancestors for jobs. And when you talk about dignity, what kind of dignified employment situation are we actually dealing with? Where it's a private Idaho that's serving a particular capricious master and the particular kind of labor, and bearing in mind with the kind of bulk that we're looking at, and the fact that it violates environmental policies provincially, nationally, and the Paris Accords. You have a kind of a system where people will come and be employed temporarily, move out with respiratory kinds of ailments, so because of the kind of dust and health aspects that we're dealing with. But the issue of land is something that the province and the city also has a responsibility in terms of dealing it. Professor London speaks about land swap. What is made available for that to happen, and that certainly is something that is held and is being withheld by the city and province for since 1652.
Thanks, Tariq, and thanks, Leslie. There's a question related to the city, and it's by Matthew Wingfield. And he's asking, how can we read this proposed development in relation to similar development decisions by the City of Cape Town? For example, in the context of the PHA, the Philippi Horticultural Area.
So those of you who read Chippy Alder's book about the City of Cape Town, A House Divided, will know that he writes about how the politics within the city plays out in development decisions, and development decisions, rezonings, can make instant millionaires out of entities that have political influence. The city appears to be dominated by planners or regulatory planners who have a mindset that economics is really the primary driver of activity and redress, and those are used in different terms, but don't really have a grasp of sustainable development as a comprehensive set of overlapping or even nested kind of relationships. So we see decisions being made always in the direction of development, and no questions around what that development actually means for people, for people's integrity, dignity, and long term. So I think in the PHA, even there were public servants who really understood the science and were discomforted, and we see that here with our development as well. There are people working in the city who are trying to do a decent job, really hard, but the people who hold the power in make decisions. So the heritage practitioners in the city are just ignored routinely. Environmental scientists in the city are really up in arms about this development, just ignored, and the same in the province. So I think we have a rotten political system, and NEMA hasn't really helped to solve the underlying problem of how decisions are made.
Thank you, Leslie. Tariq, this one's for you. It's from one of our students who is of sustainable development. Her name's Kate, and she references an article in the Daily Maverick written by Zenzele Khoisan and points to a divided First Nation stance on this development. Could you comment about that, please?
So my comment, here is corroborated with a number of Khoi and San councils. We believe that most of the San and Khoi actually, for the reasons that I've articulated, object to this development. So it includes the Naikona Council, the Kochokwa, the House of David and Klaas Stearman, the Oraqayes Indigenous Authority, the Kaman Traditional Council, the National House of the Kam Bushmen, and it includes all 11 houses. The Kaikurana Transfrontier, the Kowesa Nama Traditional Council, Khoisan Kingdom Council, and a number of Biblist entities and restorative justice entities like FINZA, the Cloud Restorative Justice Forum, and so on. And the reason why I mention these groups is because there's been a narrative that's been put out there that a group of Khoisan representatives represent the entire Southern African community in terms of how we relate to the site. I think what's very, very important is to understand that, as I indicated in my earlier presentation, this footprint holds significance across the entire Southern African plateau. It also holds significance in terms of who can comment on, in the complex tributary identity groups in the Western Cape and around the country. And for any single group to want to, through an alleged form of cultural agency, disavow all South Africans and Southern Africans, and indeed the fact that there is a global footprint of other countries and nations that are relevant in terms of how this site has a sense of meaning, including people brought down from Madagascar, Goa, Indonesia, Malaysia, East and West Africa. We come from a history of a creolized African relationship. And so who comments on the site and who does mean from that is something that is built on a human memory, of who we are as South Africans, and is universal. And so what is important, though, to answer the student's question is that take a look at the AFMAS report, because this report basically is done by an independent consultant. And out of this report emerges an entity called the First Nation Collective, which we'd never heard of before. So we're not saying that the entities in the First Nations Collective are not legitimate, but what we are saying is that this entity, this collective umbrella group, was formed out of an independent report, out of a process of consultation for what we believe are the purposes to create veiled consent, to manufacture a general sense of consent from the indigenous question, from the indigenous communities, in order, again, to justify something that goes against a symbiotic relationship that the San and Khoi has with environment, the cosmos, the river, the animals, and so forth. What's interesting about this report is that no one out of this collective speaks against the concrete. No one out of this collective seems to have a problem with the redirection of a natural river. And how the cosmology of the site is being expressed also relegates, in a way, this standard comment that needs to come out of the First Nations collective in as far as environment is concerned, in as far as democratic public participation is concerned. Why would the Khoi somehow be immune to the fact that we live in a constitutional democracy? In the name of the Khoi, particularly, what's happening is that people around the country and around the site, which has got extraordinary significance, are not being given their inalienable right to comment and to be heard on how significant the site is. And so that is highly divisive. It's not only divisive within the Khoikhoi and San, but it pits traditional communities against other communities. And I think that, take a look at the report, take a look at how the report, if any, deals with certain key aspects around environmental suggestions and so forth. But also, what's interesting about how these reports are done is that they try to argue the removal of very important heritage resources off the site, downplaying slavery, not really acknowledging this as an epicenter of First Frontier. The fact that title deeds, the very first title deeds of of where land was stolen for the first time is located here. What does that mean to South Africans? What does this mean to us in very deep ways of dealing with intergenerational trauma, of actual restitution? When we talk about the land question in this country, it starts here. And so when we begin to start, just brushing over these hugely significant narratives, we have to ask the reasons why. And for what purposes is the Indigenous report? Is this was this report put together? Was it to put together really for the aspirations of the First Nations, or was it put together in order to deal with the very difficult question that the developer has? The fact that we're dealing with some of the most intense historical and heritage resources in our country.
Thank you, Tariq. Sure. There is a question by Stephen Granger, and he prefaces his question around that development must somehow be good, some way. If developers are responsible, if they take a holistic approach to their development. And he's struggling for a balanced view. And his question is, on what basis could the development be supported? And my kind of annex is, if any. So he's asking if it is reduced scale, more significant contribution to the integrated catchment, protection of green infrastructure, etc., etc. For myself, I think, Leslie and Tariq, you've answered a little bit in what your sovereign flame is, but I think Stephen's looking for any possibility that this development could be conceived of as balanced and have value.
I wonder if I can kick off with a response to that, and thanks for that question. So if you look at the documents, one of the points that have been ignored by the developers is actually feedback from the city's own environmental management department, which says this is not the development of a heritage precinct. This is a intense mixed use in which a little bit of green has been placed. And what they would imagine is possible is that the recognition is that this is a park. This is a park of high environmental value, a park of high heritage value, in which you place some buildings. So in other words, you need a whole completely different mindset about it. And people will disagree about how that happened, but you need a process. You need a fair public participation process to do that. And in that regard, the city actually initiated a co-design development framework process for the whole of the Two Rivers Urban Park in 2017 or 18, I can't remember. Many of us participated in that, went to umpteen meetings, a manifesto developed for TRUP. There were a lot of design criteria, but then suddenly the city canned it. That whole process just stopped in midair, and they went silent and came out of 2 years later with a typical local spatial development framework plan written in a back room by consultants who were paid by the city. No more participation. So what happens is you have a design process, you have participation. If you generate something that people in power don't like, it gets put aside. We saw that actually with the River Club, the first heritage impact assessment for the River Club. The heritage consultant came up and said, look, this is important. Open space is key. It's a key heritage indicator. So any development has to respect that. What did they do? They basically got another consultant who gave a different story. And that's the problem with consultants. So I think it is quite possible for us to develop jointly a plan which is about heritage protection, is about respecting core history, is about addressing development needs, is about addressing inclusive housing. It's quite possible to do that. It's not easy, but there's no will from the decision makers. And this is basically the decision makers saying to a private entity, here, we're giving you a leg up, we're giving you help, we're bending the rules for how we rezone property. We are ignoring the fact that we've actually not followed our own SOPs to give you an environmental authorization. So the question is important, but we actually have to have a starting point where we all agree on the rules. And until we have the starting point, we're going to end up with more influence, money, power playing out in this, and that will end up in a decision that will not be sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Leslie. I think your point is echoed by one of the attendees, Erna Curry, who says the project is going ahead because of a lack of ethical governance. And I think that was your final point. Yes, Tori.
Thank you. And I think this is a very good question. When a process happens where experts step in and we agree that heritage is important, and then when meaningful public participation occurs, and in our case, there's a report that's issued on, on the First Nations aspiration, why is it that the bulk is actually increased? And that the actual mitigating measures in terms of our major concerns are not really being addressed. This is combined with an air of intimidation, an air of threat, where we see officials and activists like within this debate and on this journey having to enter into a very uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous environment. So trust has been broken. And I would like to put it to you this way, Nina. If you see a family member or someone that you revere, and let's talk about this terrain. There are bulldozers on site now that are denuding the River Club.
Yeah.
When people talk about alternatives, if a body that is a being and is being raped, do you say, well, before we start rape, what's the alternative? And the reason why I use this metaphor is because, for example, that particular golf course was an infill. It was a landfill before. This was not done by consent. And then it was desiccated again, where it was made into a Mashi golf course, which meant there was a lot more degradation of the actual soil, to the point where you have specialists saying there's absolutely there's nothing left here. Mm. And the only thing you can do is build on it and we'll make it better. This is a deeply insensitive narrative that doesn't actually acknowledge what has actually occurred on the site, and also acknowledge the intangible significance of what that site and what that space actually means. And I think that an alternative has to come with the decolonial framework. An alternative has to come with a degree of honesty. We don't want guns for hire who are experts, who will bring credentials from here to the moon and then start twisting science and start maneuvering and putting on paper narratives that will only suit what the employee is asking. This is a ground zero site for all of us as South Africans. It is something that needs to be looked at with a completely different lens in terms of how we define architecture, development, built-in environment, and how heritage itself is being. And important, who are the custodians? Who has the right to speak to the site? It can't be delimited in the particular kind of ways that it has. It needs to open up, and it will have and be an opportunity for tremendous breakthroughs in as far as how we can address sites like this as South Africans together with everyone else. And that, unfortunately, is being an opportunity flatly denied, and it's in the hands of this colonial sense of the expert, of the scientist. And I have to say this to the Khoi and San and traditional communities still suffer from an intergenerational trauma science has done. The unethical trafficking of human sacred remains, for example, where skulls and bones and so on were exported for science. The fact that even the word Khoisan is a derogatory term because it was It was put together by a guy called Leonard Schultz in 1927, a German zoologist who specialized in the biometric measurements of animals, placed Khoi and San together. It now becomes Khoisan. And ironically, it's the same man who, after the Herero genocide, took hundreds of decapitated heads, put them in a ship, and those heads were studied in Berlin, which became the bedrock of the science of eugenics that influenced Holocaust. So we can relate and trace the ill doings of these kinds of colonial frameworks in terms of, what is science, what is fact, and what is human. And I think that, we have to be much, much more sensitive in terms of how we want to frame the site and how we bring in the measure of orality and a sense of humanness onto the site.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tariq. I know that one of the scientists involved in the environmental impact assessment, and maybe a few of them, have been posting in the chat, and I notice a game of tennis a little bit between a scientist at the CST and Liz Day, who talks about a measure of restoration after all of this compounded damage, spiritual, ecological, that there will be some attempt at restoration in this development. And then there's a scientist at our center, Nadia, who says the restoration mentioned or planned assumes that you can offset the loss of a sense of place and heritage. And I think it's these two kinds of conversations that are pitted against each other. This has been a really interesting and powerful hour to spend with you all. Thank you so much. We have to end at 2:00, but it seems that there's a lot unknown, unsaid, unfinished. Thank you, Leslie, for putting up the links to the campaign. We know that you are now engaged in court and that you are putting forward applications, and the hearings will come August 16th. We wish you the best. I wish you the best. Both you, Tariq, and all of you at Make the Least Matter. And thank you for taking the time today and just really sharing with us with such conviction and passion. It's very important for how we understand our city, how we understand our agency, and where we can put that energy. So thank you so much for joining us today.